Have you ever seen a man so utterly confident he was about to ruin his wife's life that he actually smiled as the judge read the final verdict? Richard Harrison had the best corporate lawyers money could buy, an ironclad prenuptial agreement, and a heart as cold as absolute zero. He dragged his wife of 15 years to court, determined to strip her of every last dime, the family estate, and her dignity. He thought it was a simple open and soot case of a powerful man discarding a useless spouse. But Richard made one fatal, irreversible mistake. He forgot who actually built his empire in the dark. This is the story of the ultimate betrayal, a hidden masterstroke, and how an arrogant billionaire walked out of a courtroom with absolutely nothing. The evening of October 12th was supposed to be a celebration. The private dining room at Alinea, Chicago's most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant, was booked months in advance. The champagne chilling in the silver bucket was a vintage Dom Perignon, and the ambient lighting caught the subtle sparkle of the diamond tennis bracelet resting on Sarah Harrison's wrist. It was her 40th birthday. For 15 years, Sarah had been the quiet, steadfast anchor to Richard Harrison's meteoric rise. When they first met in a cramped graduate library at Northwestern University, Richard was a charismatic dreamer with a head full of grand ideas but no practical sense of how to execute them. Sarah was the pragmatist, an accounting and corporate structuring savant who preferred the background. Together they had built Crestview Holdings from a scrappy two-person logistics startup operating out of a damp basement into a multi-hundred-million-dollar real estate and supply chain empire. But as the millions rolled in, the dynamics shifted. Richard became the face of Crestview. He was the one on the covers of business magazines, the one giving keynote speeches at Davos, the one mingling with politicians and celebrities. Sarah, by mutual agreement, had stepped away from the official corporate roster 10 years prior to raise their two children, David and Emma. To the outside world, and eventually to Richard himself, Sarah was just a lucky housewife who had hitched a ride on a rocket ship. As the waiter cleared their appetizer plates, Richard leaned back in his plush leather chair. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit, his face an unreadable mask. "I have something for you, Sarah," Richard said, his voice smooth, devoid of the warmth that used to define their early years. Sarah smiled, expecting an itinerary for the trip to Tuscany they had discussed, or perhaps the deed to the summer home in the Hamptons. Richard reached into his tailored breast pocket, but instead of a velvet box or a ribbon-tied envelope, he pulled out a thick, rigid manila folder. He slid it across the pristine white linen tablecloth. "What's this?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing slightly. "Open it," Richard commanded softly. Sarah broke the seal and pulled out the crisp legal documents. The bold black letters at the top of the first page seemed to swim before her eyes. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The breath caught in her throat. The restaurant around her seemed to plunge into a vacuum, the clinking of glasses and soft jazz fading into a deafening silence. She looked up at her husband, searching for a punchline to a very cruel joke. But Richard's eyes were flat, calculating, and entirely serious. "Richard, I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling as she held the thick stack of paper. "It's over, Sarah," he said, taking a slow sip of his water. "I'm restructuring my life. Crestview is entering a new phase, an aggressive expansion, and frankly, we've grown apart. You've been perfectly happy managing the house, but I need a partner who aligns with my current trajectory." He didn't mention Jessica Trent, his 26-year-old vice president of acquisitions. He didn't mention the weekend trips to Aspen that were supposedly client retreats. He didn't need to. The cold, mechanical way he spoke was a brutal confirmation that the man sitting across from her had completely erased the last 15 years of their shared struggle. "You're serving me divorce papers on my 40th birthday?" Sarah asked, a sudden, sharp clarity piercing through the shop. "The timing is unfortunate, I'll admit," Richard sighed, feigning a brief look of regret that didn't reach his eyes. "But it's efficient. Now, regarding the settlement, my lawyers have already attached the prenuptial agreement we signed in 2011. As you'll recall, the terms are very clear." Sarah remembered the prenup. She had signed it 2 days before their wedding, exhausted, overwhelmed with wedding planning and deeply in love with a man who claimed it was just a formality his investors demanded. According to the document, in the event of a divorce, Sarah would walk away with a flat payout of $250,000, a single fifical and absolutely zero claim to Crestview Holdings or any assets acquired during the marriage. Richard had valued the company at practically nothing back then. Today it was worth nearly $500 million. $250,000? Sarah's voice was deathly quiet now. Richard, we have hundreds of millions in assets. We built this together. I wrote the original business plan. I structured the offshore accounts. I filed the initial patents. Richard let out a short, patronizing laugh. Sarah, please, don't embarrass yourself. You typed up some documents 15 years ago. I built this empire. I took the risks. The pre-nup is ironclad. You will take the settlement. You will vacate the Lake Forest estate by the end of the month, and we can make this seamless for the kids. If you fight me, he leaned forward, the mask slipping to reveal the ruthless shark underneath. I will bleed you dry in court. I will drag this out until you are entirely bankrupt, and you will walk away with nothing. Sarah looked down at the papers, then back at the man she once loved. A profound, icy calm suddenly washed over her. The shock dissolved, replaced by something far more dangerous. Seamless, Sarah echoed, nodding slowly. She placed the papers back into the folder, closed it, and stood up from the table. She didn't throw her wine. She didn't scream. Enjoy your dinner, Richard. She walked out of the restaurant, leaving the diamond bracelet sitting next to the untouched champagne. The war had begun. By 9 a.m. the following Monday, Richard Harrison's brutal strategy was already in full swing. When Sarah went to an ATM to withdraw cash for groceries, the machine swallowed her card. A quick, panicked check of her banking app revealed that the joint checking and savings accounts had been frozen. Her platinum credit cards were cancelled. Richard had systematically cut off her financial oxygen, a classic, ruthless tactic designed to force a financially weaker spouse into immediate submission. Richard sat in the opulent, mahogany-paneled office of Gregory Houseman, a senior partner at Chicago's most feared corporate and family law firm. Gregory was a man who looked exactly like what he was, a highly paid apex predator. He wore a pinstripe suit that cost more than most people's cars, and he had a reputation for leaving opposing counsel in tears. The accounts are locked down, Richard, Gregory said, pouring 2 glasses of 18-year-old scotch despite the early hour. She has roughly $2,000 in a personal checking account that we couldn't legally touch. Beyond that, she's adrift. Richard took the glass, a smug smile playing on his lips. Good. The faster she realizes she has no leverage, the faster she signs the final waiver. I want her out of the house by Friday. Jessica is already picking out new furniture. Gregory chuckled, swirling the amber liquid. The prenup is airtight, Richard. I drafted it myself. We used the standard separate property clauses. Everything Crestview touches, every subsidiary, every real estate holding is shielded. Unless she suddenly finds a couple of $1 million to hire a firm like mine to challenge the unconscionability of the agreement, she's completely out of options. She won't fight, Richard stated confidently. Sarah is passive. She hates conflict. She'll panic, cry to her friends, and then she'll take the $250,000 just to survive. It's a generous offer for someone who hasn't worked a real job in a decade. Across town, in a drastically different setting, Sarah Harrison was not crying. She sat in the cramped, cluttered office of Miranda Foley. Miranda's office was located above a dry cleaner in a strip mall in the suburbs. There were no mahogany desks or original oil paintings here, just stacks of manila folders, the smell of burnt coffee, and a lawyer who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days. But Sarah hadn't chosen Miranda because she was glamorous. She chose Miranda because she was brilliant, hungry, and entirely off Richard's radar. He's frozen everything, Miranda said, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses as she looked over the emergency financial injunctions Richard's team had filed. Classic Gregory Houseman move. He's trying to starve you out before the first hearing. I know, Sarah said, her voice steady. She pulled a heavy, encrypted hard drive from her worn leather tote bag and placed it on Miranda's desk. But Richard made a fundamental miscalculation. Miranda looked at the hard drive, then back at Sarah. What's this? Richard thinks I've been a housewife for 10 years, Sarah explained, leaning forward. He thinks my involvement with Crestview ended the day our son was born. He forgot that I am the one who set up the primary server architecture for the company's accounting software in 2008. I never surrendered my administrative access. For the past decade, while he was out having affairs and giving interviews, I have been quietly monitoring every single transaction, every shell company, and every offshore transfer he has made. Miranda's eyebrows shot up. Are you saying you have proof of hidden assets? I'm saying I have the entire blueprint of his empire, Sarah corrected her. Richard is greedy. He hates paying taxes. Over the last 5 years, he's been aggressively shifting capital out of the main Crestview corporate umbrella to prepare for taking the company public. He used a labyrinth of LLCs to buy up commercial real estate in Nevada and Delaware. He thinks those assets are protected from the divorce because they aren't technically under his name or the main holding company. And the pre-nup? Miranda asked, tapping her pen against the desk. Houseman is going to rely heavily on that. It specifically excludes you from any growth of Crestview Holdings. A chilling, predatory smile, one that Richard had never seen, crossed Sarah's face. The prenup protects Crestview Holdings and its direct subsidiaries, Sarah said softly. That what Richard doesn't know, what he completely overlooked when he was blindly signing the incorporation papers I prepared for him years ago, is the ownership structure of the foundational intellectual property. Miranda leaned in, her lawyer's instinct suddenly entirely awake. Go on. Crestview's entire valuation, the reason it's worth $500 million, relies on a proprietary logistics algorithm called OmniRoute. It's the software that revolutionized their supply chain, Sarah explained. Richard assumes Crestview owns OmniRoute, but Crestview doesn't own it. They license it. Miranda's jaw dropped slightly. Who do they license it from? A small, seemingly defunct holding company incorporated in the Cayman Islands called Horizon Tech Limited, Sarah said. And guess whose name is the sole managing director and 100% equity holder of Horizon Tech? Miranda stared at the unassuming, conservatively dressed mother of two sitting across from her. Suddenly she didn't see a helpless housewife. She saw a master tactician who had been biding her time. You, Miranda whispered. Me, Sarah confirmed. I let him build the castle, Miranda, but I own the land it sits on. And it's time to evict him. But first, we have to let him think he's winning. We have to let him walk blindly into the trap. So, what's the play? Miranda asked, a genuine thrill in her voice. We play the victim, Sarah said smoothly. We file a desperate motion for temporary spousal support. We make it look like I'm begging for scraps. We get him into a deposition room, and we let Gregory Houseman talk down to me on the record. We get Richard to testify under oath about his absolute ownership of Crestview and all its assets. Once he purges himself by claiming the algorithm as his own, we drop the guillotine. 3 months later, the legal proceedings had reached the deposition phase. True to the plan, Sarah had played the part of the battered, desperate wife perfectly. She had moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment, driven a 10-year-old sedan, and filed motions begging for access to funds just to pay for her children's basic needs. Richard, intoxicated by his perceived dominance, had denied every request, further solidifying his image on paper as an unyielding tyrant. The deposition took place in the glass-walled conference room of Gregory Houseman's downtown firm. The tension in the room was palpable. Richard sat perfectly relaxed, sipping a sparkling water, looking like a man attending a minor administrative meeting rather than a divorce deposition. Gregory sat beside him, his posture radiating arrogance. Across the wide table sat Sarah, dressed in a simple, inexpensive gray suit, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Next to her was Miranda Foley, looking distinctly out of place amidst the high-end modern art and panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. The court reporter hit record on the stenography machine. Let's get this over with, Gregory began, not even trying to hide his disdain. He spent the first 2 hours methodically attempting to humiliate Sarah on the record. He questioned her lack of employment, the spending habits, and her contributions to the marriage, carefully framing her as a financial parasite who had coasted on Richard's genius. Mrs. Harrison, Gregory said, pacing slightly behind his chair, would you agree that since the year 2011, you have not held a formal job title, drawn a salary, or contributed in any material financial way to the growth of Crestview Holdings? I was raising our 2 children, Mr. Houseman, Sarah replied, her voice perfectly modulated, betraying no emotion. As my husband and I mutually agreed. Yes, the children, Gregory dismissed with a wave of his hand. But strictly speaking about the business. You did not secure investments, you did not negotiate contracts, and you certainly did not engineer the OmniRoute software that serves as the backbone of the company's current valuation. Correct. Sarah glanced briefly at Miranda, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. I did not physically write the code for the final version of the software. No, Sarah answered truthfully. Richard smirked, leaning over to whisper something in Gregory's ear. Gregory nodded approvingly. Excellent. We have established that you have zero claim to the intellectual property or the operational success of Crestview, Gregory stated for the record. Now, moving on to the prenuptial agreement. Actually, Mr. Houseman, Miranda interrupted, her voice cutting through the smug atmosphere like a knife. Before we discuss the prenuptial agreement, I have a few questions for Mr. Bass Harrison regarding the asset disclosure forms he submitted to the court last week. Gregory sighed dramatically. Make it quick, Miss Foley. We are on a schedule. Bye. Miranda pulled a thin file from her briefcase and opened it. Mr. Harrison, in your sworn financial affidavit, you list Crestview Holdings as your primary asset, valuing your 80% stake at approximately $420 million. Is this correct? It is, Richard answered, his tone dripping with boredom. And you base this valuation heavily on the proprietary logistics systems Crestview utilizes, specifically the OmniRoute software architecture. Miranda pressed. Obviously, Richard scoffed. It's the best supply chain management tool in the Western Hemisphere. It's the crown jewel of the company. And you affirm, under penalty of perjury, that Crestview Holdings owns this software outright? Miranda asked, her eyes locking onto Richard's. Richard didn't even hesitate. Yes, Crestview owns it. I own Crestview. Miranda paused. The silence in the room stretched for a long, agonizing moment. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the grain of the mahogany table, her expression serene. Mr. Harrison, Miranda continued softly, are you familiar with an entity known as Horizon Tech Limited? For the first time all morning, the smug expression on Richard's face faltered. It was a microscopic shift, a slight tightening of the jaw, a brief flicker of confusion in his eyes. He glanced at Gregory, who looked equally puzzled. The name sounds vaguely familiar. A vendor, perhaps, Richard answered, though his voice had lost a fraction of its absolute certainty. Miranda reached into her file and pulled out a stack of documents bearing the official seal of the Cayman Islands Corporate Registry, alongside a heavily redacted licensing agreement. She slid them across the massive table. Let me refresh your memory, Miranda said. Horizon Tech Limited is the registered owner of the base patents and the core source code for the OmniRoute software. According to this licensing agreement, signed by you in 2010, Crestview Holdings merely leases the rights to use the software. A lease that, incidentally, is set for renewal next month. Gregory snatched the documents before Richard could reach them. His eyes darted rapidly across the legal jargon, his face draining of color. This is irrelevant, Gregory snapped, though his voice lacked its previous authority. Even if Crestview licenses the software, it's a standard corporate structure. It becomes highly relevant, Mr. Houseman, Miranda countered, leaning forward, when you look at the ownership of Horizon Tech Limited. Turn to page 4 of the registry document. Richard ripped the packet from his lawyer's hands and flipped to the 4th page. His eyes scanned the text, stopping dead at the bottom line. The color vanished from his face, replaced by a sickly, ashen gray. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Listed as the sole managing director, the 100% equity owner, and the ultimate beneficiary of Horizon Tech Limited in bold black ink was a single name, Sarah Jenkins Harrison. You don't own the crown jewel of your empire, Richard, Sarah spoke up, her voice finally breaking the silence. It wasn't loud, but it resonated with the force of an earthquake. I do, and I think it's time we discussed my licensing renewal fees. The silence in Gregory Houseman's conference room was eventually broken by the harsh, metallic click of Miranda Foley closing her briefcase. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply stood up, smoothing the front of her inexpensive gray skirt. "We will forward the new licensing terms to your office by the end of the business day, Mr. Houseman," Miranda said, her voice brisk and professional. "Given that the current lease expires in exactly 14 days, I suggest you advise your client to review them promptly." "Good day." Sarah stood, giving Richard one last impassive look before turning on her heel. She walked out of the glass-walled room with the posture of a queen leaving a conquered territory. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut, Richard erupted. "What the hell was that, Gregory?" he roared, slamming his fist onto the polished mahogany table so hard the water glasses rattled. "You told me the pre-nup was airtight. You told me she had nothing." Gregory Houseman, a man who usually projected the calm, lethal energy of a striking viper, was visibly sweating. He frantically flipped through the Cayman Islands registry documents Miranda had left behind, his eyes scanning for a forgery, a loophole, a clerical error, anything. "The prenup is airtight regarding Crestview Holdings," Gregory stammered, loosening his silk Hermes tie. "But if she legitimately owns the foundational intellectual property through a foreign entity, Richard, why didn't you know who owned the software your entire company runs on?" "Because she handled the administrative garbage back in 2010. Richard yelled, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. "I was busy securing seed capital. I was out pitching to venture capitalists. She put a stack of incorporation papers on my desk, told me it was a tax-efficient licensing structure, and I signed them. I assumed she set it up under my name, or at least under a subsidiary I controlled." Gregory slumped into his leather chair, rubbing his temples. "You didn't read the documents. You signed away the core IP of a $500 million logistics firm to a shell company without verifying the beneficiary." "Fix it," Richard snarled, leaning over the table, his face inches from his lawyer's. "I pay you $1,000 an hour to be a shark. So bite her, invalidate the patent, claim marital fraud, tie her up in litigation for the next decade. Do whatever it takes. I'll file an emergency injunction to halt any changes to the licensing agreement," Gregory said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But Richard, if her lawyer is smart and judging by that ambush, she is that Cayman entity was likely funded with separate premarital assets. If that's the case, your own prenuptial agreement, the one that explicitly protects separate property and its derivatives, is exactly what's going to shield her company from you." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The very shield he had forged to leave his wife destitute was now a reinforced steel wall protecting her ultimate weapon. By the time Richard returned to the Crestview Holdings executive suites on the 65th floor of the Eon Center, the panic was setting in. He bypassed his assistant and marched straight into the office of Jessica Trent, his vice president of acquisitions, and a woman who was already redecorating Sarah's house in her head. Jessica looked up from her dual monitors, a bright, confident smile on her face. "Richard, how did the deposition go? Did the Ice Queen finally crack?" Richard shut the door, locked it, and closed the motorized blinds. "We have a problem, a massive problem." Over the next 20 minutes, Richard explained the catastrophe. He watched Jessica's expression morph from smug anticipation to profound horror. She wasn't just his mistress. She was a sharp corporate operative who owned substantial stock options in Crestview. She immediately understood the math. "Richard," Jessica said, her voice trembling, "OmniRoute isn't just a tool we use. It is the only reason BlackRock is considering underwriting our IPO next quarter. Our proprietary algorithm is our entire competitive advantage over FedEx and Amazon Logistics. If we don't own it—" "I know," Richard snapped. "If word leaks to the board or to our institutional investors that a bitter, soon-to-be ex-wife holds our core IP hostage, the valuation will tank," Jessica continued, her breathing shallow. "We won't just lose the IPO. We'll face a shareholder revolt. They'll demand your resignation for gross fiduciary negligence." The reality of the situation crashed down on Richard like a collapsing building. Sarah hadn't just found a way to get her hands on his money. She had positioned a dagger directly over the beating heart of his legacy, and she was holding the handle. At 4:59 p.m. that afternoon, a courier delivered a thick, sealed envelope to Gregory Houseman's office. It contained the new licensing demands from Horizon Tech Limited. When Gregory called Richard to read the terms over the phone, the lawyer's voice was hollow. "What does she want?" Richard asked, pouring himself 3 fingers of Macallan in his darkened office. "She isn't asking for a flat fee," Gregory said quietly. "She's demanding an annual licensing royalty of 12% of Crestviews' gross global revenue, backdated for the last 3 fiscal years as a penalty for breach of the original, undervalued terms." Richard choked on his scotch. 12% of gross, not net. That's over $40 million a year. Plus back pay. It would entirely wipe out our operating margins. It would bankrupt the company. "There's an alternative clause," Gregory added, clearing his throat. "Read it. In lieu of financial royalties, Horizon Tech Limited will accept a controlling equity stake in Crestview Holdings, specifically 51% of voting shares, to be transferred immediately to Sarah Jenkins Harrison." Richard hurled his crystal glass against the wall, shattering it into 100 pieces. The amber liquid stained the expensive silk wallpaper. She didn't want a payout. She wanted the throne. The next 2 weeks were a bloodbath of corporate warfare. Richard, driven by pure hubris, refused to negotiate. He ordered his internal engineering team to urgently reverse-engineer the OmniRoute software and build a proprietary replacement from scratch before the lease expired. "Throw money at it," Richard screamed at his chief technology officer during a frantic late-night meeting. "Hire every freelance coder in Silicon Valley if you have to. Build me a bypass." But software architecture that took a decade to refine couldn't be replicated in 14 days. The engineers hit a brick wall. OmniRoute's code was heavily encrypted, and its predictive routing algorithms were inextricably woven into every facet of Crestview's servers. Removing it was like trying to remove the nervous system from a living patient without killing them. Meanwhile, Sarah and Miranda executed their next move with surgical precision. They didn't leak the information to the press. They went straight to the apex predators. Miranda drafted a highly confidential, legally obligated notice of impending IP severance and formally mailed it to Crestview's top 3 institutional investors, including Vanguard and the aforementioned BlackRock Group. The notice simply stated that due to a private dispute, the core logistical software running Crestview would go dark in less than 10 days, and they should adjust their risk portfolios accordingly. The fallout was instantaneous. At 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, Richard was summoned to an emergency, off-the-books meeting by the Crestview Board of Directors. William "Bill" Danvers, the board chairman and the man who had famously orchestrated hostile takeovers in the 90s, did not offer Richard a seat. "We received a very interesting piece of mail yesterday, Richard," Bill said, tossing the notice of severance onto the table. "Care to explain why Vanguard called me at 2 a.m. threatening to dump their entire holding of our debt?" Richard swallowed hard, his usual charismatic armor completely fractured. "It's a personal matter, Bill. My wife was attempting to leverage a clerical error in an old licensing agreement during our divorce proceedings. My legal team is handling it." "A clerical error?" Bill's voice was deceptively soft, a dangerous rumble. "I had our forensic auditors pull the original corporate filings from 2010. You signed over the IP, Richard. You didn't even read the beneficiary line. You committed the cardinal sin of a CEO. You assumed you were the smartest person in the room." "I built this company," Richard protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "She was a housewife. She typed up the papers." "And she clearly typed them very well," Bill retorted coldly. "Here is the reality of your situation, Richard. In exactly 8 days, the software that routes 3,000 trucks, manages 4 million square feet of warehouse space, and fulfills contracts for Target and Home Depot will shut down. We will be in breach of contract with every major client we have. I'm having the engineers build a bypass." "Shut up," Bill commanded. The room fell dead silent. You are toxic, Richard. You let your ego and your inability to keep your pants zipped jeopardize a $500 million enterprise. The board convened a vote at 7 a.m. Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. You can't. I own 80% of the company. You own 80% of a company that is about to have a valuation of 0, Bill corrected him. However, your wife's attorney reached out to us late last night with a very pragmatic solution. Sarah is willing to forgive the backdated penalties and grant us a perpetual, irrevocable license to Omni-Route. In exchange for what? Richard whispered, dread pooling in his stomach. In exchange for your immediate resignation as CEO, Bill said, his eyes devoid of pity, and the transfer of all your equity, your entire 80% stake to her, structured as a divorce settlement to avoid capital gains tax. If you sign it, the company survives. The board retains its minority shares, and we avoid an SEC investigation into your failure to disclose material risks. Richard was hyperventilating. I will be left with nothing. Absolutely nothing. Bill leaned forward, resting his hands on the mahogany table. You have an ironclad prenuptial agreement, do you not? I believe she gets a car and $250,000. I suggest you ask her nicely if she'll let you keep the car. The drive from the Crestview Holdings executive tower to Gregory Houseman's downtown law firm took only 20 minutes, but for Richard Harrison, it felt like a descent into purgatory. The relentless Chicago rain lashed against the tinted windows of his chauffeured Maybach, mirroring the storm of panic raging inside his chest. He burst into Gregory's office without knocking, ignoring the startled protest of the paralegal at the front desk. Gregory was already packing his leather briefcase. The sprawling files regarding the Harrison divorce, once neatly organized and weaponized, were now being unceremoniously shoved into cardboard bankers' boxes. What are you doing? Richard demanded, his bespoke suit damp from the rain, his meticulously styled hair disheveled. We have to file an injunction against the board. We have to sue William Danvers for shareholder oppression. Gregory paused, snapping the brass locks on his briefcase shut with a sharp final click. He looked at Richard not with the deference usually reserved for a billionaire client, but with the weary annoyance of a man dealing with a bankrupt nuisance. Sit down, Richard, Gregory sighed, gesturing to the chair Richard had arrogantly occupied just weeks prior. There is no injunction. There is no lawsuit against the board. I just spent an hour on the phone with Danvers and the corporate counsel for Vanguard. If you try to fight this, Vanguard will immediately dump their debt holdings, citing catastrophic risk to the operational infrastructure. Crestview's stock, even privately held, will plummet to pennies on the dollar. You will be holding 80% of absolutely nothing. So, I'm just supposed to sign it all over, my entire life's work? Richard's voice was a ragged whisper. It wasn't just your work, was it? Gregory replied coldly. You lied to me, Richard. You told me you built the company single-handedly. You failed to disclose that your wife held the keys to the kingdom. My firm operates on a very strict retainer basis. Given that your personal accounts are heavily leveraged against Crestview shares that are about to be transferred or rendered worthless, I have to ask how you plan to pay my outstanding invoices, which currently total over $300,000. Richard stared at the lawyer, the reality of his isolation finally sinking in. The apex predator had smelled blood in the water, and it was Richard's. You're dropping me, Richard said, stunned. I am advising you, as my final act as your counsel, to take the deal, Gregory said, slipping into his trench coat. Sign the transfer papers, resign as CEO. Take the $250,000 pre-nup payout that you so carefully crafted. Take your car and walk away before the SEC decides to look into how you represented the company's IP ownership to your investors. You played a dangerous game of chess, Richard, but you only looked at half the board. With nothing left to say, Richard stumbled out of the law firm. He didn't call his driver. He walked 4 blocks in the pouring rain to the luxury condominium building where Jessica Trent lived. He needed an ally. He needed the woman who had promised him they would conquer the corporate world together. He keyed into her penthouse, dripping water onto the imported Italian marble foyer. Jessica was in the living room, a glass of white wine in her hand, staring blankly at the breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. She didn't turn around when the door opened. "Jessica," Richard breathed, stepping toward her. "It's a disaster. The board ambushed me." "Sarah." She had a kill switch built into the licensing agreement. "I have to step down." Jessica finally turned. There was no sympathy in her eyes, no warmth, no shared outrage. Her face was a mask of pure, calculated survival. "I know," Jessica said, taking a sip of her wine. "William Danvers called me an hour ago. He informed the executive team of the leadership transition." "We can start over," Richard pleaded, reaching for her hands, but she stepped back, out of his reach. "I still have my contacts. We can build a new firm." "The competitor. With what capital, Richard?" Jessica asked, her voice laced with a stinging pity. "Your assets are tied up in this settlement. Your reputation in this city is radioactive. You didn't just lose a company. You almost tanked the portfolios of 3 major institutional investors because you were too arrogant to read a contract. You are a liability. I did this for us." Richard yelled, his desperation curdling into anger. "I filed those papers so we could be together without her draining my wealth." "You did this for your ego," Jessica corrected him sharply. "I hitched my wagon to a visionary, Richard, not a cautionary tale. Danvers offered me a choice. I can stay on as VP of Acquisitions under the new CEO, or I can clean out my desk by Friday. I have unvested stock options to protect." Richard felt the ground open up beneath him. "You're staying. You're going to work for Sarah." "I'm going to work for the majority shareholder of Crestview Holdings," Jessica said, turning her back to him to face the window again. "Please leave your key on the counter on your way out." 48 hours later, the final act of Richard's reign concluded in a sterile, windowless arbitration room. There were no Michelin-starred meals, no vintage champagne. Sarah sat at the table alongside Miranda Foley. Gone was the cheap, oversized gray suit she had worn to the deposition. Today, Sarah wore an impeccably tailored navy blue blazer, her hair sleek, her posture radiating an effortless, terrifying authority. Richard sat across from her, looking 10 years older. The shadows under his eyes were bruised and heavy. He was accompanied by a junior associate from Gregory Houseman's firm, sent merely to witness the signatures. Miranda slid a thick stack of documents across the table. "Leo, the transfer agreements, Mr. Harrison," Miranda stated, her tone brisk. 80% of Crestview Holdings equity, transferred to Sarah Jenkins Harrison as a tax-exempt divorce settlement. In exchange, Horizon Tech Limited grants Crestview a perpetual, irrevocable license to the OmniRoute software, and we waive all claims to retroactive royalties. Richard picked up the Mont Blanc pen resting beside the papers. His hand shook violently. He looked up at Sarah. He searched her face for a flicker of hesitation, a hint of the soft, compliant woman he thought he had married. But her eyes were like polished obsidian, beautiful, cold, and entirely impenetrable. "You planned this," Richard choked out, the pen hovering over the signature line. "From the very beginning. I planned for our future, Richard," Sarah said, her voice perfectly calm. "I built the foundation that allowed you to fly, but when you decided to cut my parachute, you forgot who packed the bag. Sign the papers." Richard swallowed hard, lowered his head, and signed his name. With every stroke of the pen, billions of dollars of future revenue, his legacy and his identity vanished. When the final document was signed, Miranda reached into her folder and pulled out one last item. It was a single crisp cashier's check. She slid it across the table until it rested perfectly in front of Richard. "And as per the terms of the prenuptial agreement you insisted upon," Miranda said, a faint, razor-sharp smile playing on her lips, "here is your settlement. $250,000. You are also permitted to retain the 2019 Audi A6 currently registered in your name. Please ensure you have vacated the Lake Forest estate by midnight." Richard stared at the check. The exact weapon he had forged to destroy his wife had been handed back to him as a severance package from his own life. Monday morning at the Eon Center brought a palpable shift in the atmospheric pressure on the 65th floor. The rumors had been swirling all weekend, whispers of a boardroom coup, of Richard's sudden catastrophic breakdown, of a mysterious new majority shareholder stepping into the light. At precisely 8:30 a.m., The elevator doors chimed and opened. Sarah Harrison stepped out. She moved with a quiet, undeniable gravity. She didn't march or swagger the way Richard used to. She simply commanded the space by existing within it. William Danvers, the formidable board chairman, was waiting for her in the lobby. To the shock of the assembled administrative staff, the notoriously ruthless corporate raider extended his hand with genuine respect. "Welcome back to Crestview, Madam CEO," William said. "Thank you, Bill," Sarah replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Let's get to work." Her first order of business was not a company-wide address or a press release. It was a private meeting in her new corner office. The mahogany desk had been cleared of Richard's vanity awards and golf memorabilia. "Send in Jessica Trent," Sarah instructed her new assistant over the intercom. A moment later, Jessica entered the office. The younger woman looked visibly tense, her usual bravado replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. She sat in the leather chair opposite the desk, clutching her tablet like a shield. "Good morning, Sarah," Jessica started, trying to force a professional smile. "I have the Q3 acquisition target reports ready for your review. I know the transition has been abrupt, but I want to assure you that my loyalty is to the company." Sarah didn't look at the reports. She leaned back in her chair, studying the woman who had slept in her bed, who had planned to move into her home, and who had gleefully anticipated her financial ruin. "Your loyalty is to your own survival, Jessica," Sarah said, her voice devoid of malice, which somehow made it infinitely more intimidating. "And while I appreciate the instinct, it is not a metric I value in my executive team." Jessica's forced smile vanished. "Bill Danvers said I could keep my position." "Bill Danvers manages the board. He does not manage the day-to-day operations." "I do," Sarah corrected her smoothly. "I spent the weekend reviewing the acquisition targets you championed over the last 18 months. You over-leveraged the company to buy up mid-tier warehousing in the Sunbelt at peak market prices, ignoring the data analytics that predicted a drop in commercial real estate values in those specific sectors." Jessica bristled, her pride wounded. "Richard approved those acquisitions." "Richard approved them because you convinced him they looked good on a quarterly earnings report, and he was too distracted by his personal life to run the predictive models," Sarah countered. "I ran the models. Your strategy has cost this company $30 million in depreciating assets. You aren't just a moral liability, Jessica. You are an operational failure." Sarah slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "This is your termination notice, effective immediately," Sarah said. "Because you are being dismissed for cause, specifically gross negligence in fiduciary forecasting. Your unvested stock options are forfeit. Human resources will escort you out." Jessica stared at the paper, the color draining from her perfectly contoured face. She had abandoned Richard to save her wealth, only to realize the new queen was 10 times more ruthless than the fallen king. She stood up, her hand shaking, and left the office without a word. By 1 p.m., Sarah was standing at the head of the massive boardroom table. The entire executive suite and the board of directors were assembled. Many of the men in the room had only ever known Sarah as the quiet +1 at company holiday parties. They looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Sarah didn't waste time on platitudes. She activated the massive digital display behind her, bringing up a complex multi-layered schematic of the OmniRoute software architecture integrated with Crestview's global logistics map. "For the past 10 years, Crestview has operated on autopilot," Sarah began, pacing slowly at the head of the room. "We have relied on a foundational algorithm to optimize routes, but we have failed to innovate our physical infrastructure to match it." Richard focused on aggressive expansion and optical growth. "I am focusing on efficiency, integration, and aggressive stabilization." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah dismantled the company's existing 5-year plan and rebuilt it in front of their eyes. She spoke without notes, citing specific shipping tonnage metrics, fuel cost projections, and international tariff loopholes. She identified redundancies in the supply chain that the CFO hadn't even noticed, and proposed a restructuring of their debt that would free up $50 million in liquid capital by the end of the fiscal year. By the time she finished, the skepticism in the room had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, absolute reverence. William Danvers leaned back in his chair, a rare, genuine smile on his face. "Well," Bill said, looking around the room, "I believe it's safe to say that the era of Richard Harrison is officially over. Madam CEO, the floor is yours." 6 months later, the dust had fully settled. Under Sarah's leadership, Crestview Holdings didn't just survive the transition, it thrived. The planned IPO launched flawlessly, oversubscribed by institutional investors who were thrilled by the new hyper-efficient corporate governance. Sarah Jenkins Harrison was featured on the cover of Forbes, not as a socialite wife, but as the architect of the supply chain revolution. Across town, life looked profoundly different for the man who had once thought he owned the world. Richard Harrison lived in a generic, 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-rise building out in the western suburbs. The 2019 Audi, his sole prize from the prenuptial agreement, was parked in the communal garage. His $250,000 settlement had evaporated terrifyingly fast. Between paying off personal debts that weren't covered by the corporate umbrella, first and last month's rent, and living expenses, he was bleeding cash. He had tried to launch a consulting firm, leveraging his name. But in the corporate world, weakness is a contagion. No one wanted to hire the CEO who was outsmarted and ousted by his own housewife. His calls went unreturned. His emails bounced back. It was a bleak Tuesday afternoon when Richard walked down to the lobby to check his mail. Among the glossy flyers for local pizza delivery and utility bills was a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the return address of Miranda Foley's law firm. Richard's stomach knotted. He tore it open. It was a formal notification regarding the finalization of the custody and child support arrangements for David and Emma. Because Sarah was now a billionaire and Richard was essentially unemployed, the court had ruled that Richard owed no child support. However, there was a secondary document attached. It was a legally binding offer from Sarah's family trust to ensure the children's father maintains a standard of living that allows for appropriate visitation. The trust offers a monthly stipend of $4,000, conditional upon Richard Harrison's completion of a mandatory bi-weekly financial management course and weekly breathalyzer submissions. Given his recent history of instability, Richard stared at the paper, the humiliation burning in his throat like acid. She wasn't just defeating him, she was pitying him. She was offering him an allowance, heavily conditional, just as he had once tried to starve her out with a frozen bank account. He looked around the dingy lobby of his apartment building, listening to the hum of the vending machine in the corner. He thought back to the Michelin-starred restaurant, the vintage champagne, and the absolute certainty he had felt when he slid that manila folder across the table. He had dragged his wife to court to take everything. He had intended to leave her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a modest check. But as he stood there, holding the offer of a pity stipend from the woman who now ruled his empire, Richard Harrison finally understood the absolute truth. He was the one who had walked away with nothing, and he had hand-delivered her the crown. If there is one lesson to take away from the dramatic downfall of Richard Harrison, it is this: never underestimate the quiet architect of your success. Arrogance may build a fragile empire, but it is loyalty, intelligence, and meticulous planning that sustain it. Sarah didn't just win a legal battle. She reclaimed the throne she built with her own 2 hands. Betrayal has a price, and in this case the receipt was $500 million. Did you enjoy this story of ultimate karma and corporate chess? We bring you the most unbelievable real-life tales of revenge, justice, and jaw-dropping twists every single week. Don't let the algorithms hide us from you. Hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out.